perfectly she matched her strange surroundings. Black-robed, black-haired, with black-gray eyes and a grave, sad face of ivory pallor, she stood, like one of old Terborch's portraits, a harmony in tone so low as to be but one step removed from monochrome. Obviously a lady, in spite of the worn and rusty dress, and something in the poise of the head and the set of the straight brows hinted at a spirit that adversity had hardened rather than broken. "I must ask you to forgive me for keeping you waiting," she said, and as she spoke a certain softening at the corners of the austere mouth reminded me of the absurd position in which she had found me. I murmured that the trifling delay was of no consequence whatever, that I had, in fact, been rather glad of the rest, and I was beginning somewhat vaguely to approach the subject of the invalid when the voice from the adjoining room again broke forth with hideous distinctness. "I tell you I'll do nothing of the kind. Why, confound you, it's nothing less than a conspiracy that you're proposing." Miss Bellingham, as I assumed her to be, stepped quickly across the floor, flushing angrily, as well she might, but as she reached the door it flew open, and a small, spruce, middle-aged man burst into the room. "Your father is mad, Ruth," he exclaimed, "absolutely stark mad, and I refuse to hold any further communication with him." "The present interview was not of his seeking," Miss Bellingham replied coldly. "No, it was not," was the wrathful rejoinder. "It was my mistaken generosity. But there, what is the use of talking? I've done my best for you, and I'll do no more. Don't trouble to let me out. I can find my way. Good morning." And with a stiff bow and a quick glance at me, the speaker strode out of the room, banging the door after him. "I must apologize for this extraordinary reception," said Miss Bellingham, "but I believe medical men are not easily astonished. I will introduce you to your patient now." She opened the door, and as I followed her into the adjoining room, she said, "Here is another visitor for you, dear. Dr. "Berkeley," said I. "I am acting for my friend, Dr. Barnard." The invalid, a fine-looking man of about 55, who sat propped up in bed with a pile of pillows, held out an excessively shaky hand, which I grasped cordially, making a mental note of the tremor. "How do you do, sir?" said Mr. Bellingham. "I hope Dr. Barnard is not ill?" "Oh, no," I answered. "He has gone for a trip down the Mediterranean on a currant ship. The chance occurred rather suddenly, and I bustled him off before he had time to change his mind. Hence my rather unceremonious appearance, which I hope you will forgive." "Not at all," was the hearty response. "I am delighted to hear that you sent him off. He wanted a holiday, poor man. And I am delighted to make your acquaintance, too." "It is very good of you," I said, whereupon he bowed as gracefully as a man may who is propped up in bed with a heap of pillows, and having thus exchanged broadsides of civility, so to speak, we, or at least I, proceeded to business. "How long have you been laid up?" I asked cautiously, not wishing to make too evident the fact that my principal had given me no information respecting his case. "A week to-day," he replied. "The Fons and Origo Mali was a hansom cab which upset me opposite the law courts, sent me sprawling in the middle of the road. My own fault, of course. At least the cabby said so, and I suppose he knew. But that was no consolation to me." "Were you hurt much?" "No, not really. But the fall bruised my knee rather badly and gave me a deuce of a shake-up. I'm too old for that sort of thing, you know." "Most people are," said I. "True, but you can take a cropper more gracefully at 20 than at 55. However, the knee is getting on quite well. You shall see it presently, and you observe that I am giving it complete rest. But that isn't the whole of the trouble, or the worst of it. It's my confounded nerves. I'm as irritable as the devil, and as nervous as a cat. I can't get a decent night's rest." I recalled the tremulous hand that he had offered me. He did not look like a drinker, but still. "Do you smoke much?" I inquired diplomatically. He looked at me slyly and chuckled. "That's a very delicate way to approach the subject, Doctor," he said. "No, I don't smoke much, and I don't crook my little finger. I saw you look at my shaky hand just now. Oh, it's all right. I'm not offended. It's a doctor's business to keep his eyelids lifting, but my hand is steady enough as a rule, when I'm not upset. But the least excitement sets me shaking like a jelly, and the fact is I have just had a deucedly unpleasant interview." "I think," Miss Bellingham interrupted, "Dr. Berkeley and, indeed, the neighborhood at large are aware of the fact." Mr. Bellingham laughed rather shamefacedly. "I'm afraid I did lose my temper," he said. "But I'm an impulsive old fellow, Doctor, and when I'm put out I'm apt to speak my mind, a little too bluntly, perhaps." "And audibly," his daughter added, Do you know that Dr. Berkeley was reduced to the necessity of stopping his ears?" She glanced at me as she spoke, with something like a twinkle in her solemn gray eyes. "Did I shout?" Mr. Bellingham asked, not very contritely, I thought, though he added, "I'm very sorry, my dear, but it won't happen again. I think we've seen the last of that good gentleman." "I am sure I hope so," she rejoined, adding, "And now I will leave you to your talk. I shall be in the next room if you should want me." I opened the door for her, and when she had passed on with a stiff little bow, I seated myself by the bedside and resumed the consultation. It was evidently a case of nervous breakdown, to which the cab accident had, no doubt, contributed. As to the other antecedents, they were of no concern of mine, though Mr. Bellingham seemed to think otherwise, for he resumed: "That cab business was the last straw, you know, and it finished me off. But I've been going down the hill for a long time. I've had a lot of trouble during the last 2 years, but I suppose I oughtn't to pester you with the details of my personal affairs." "Anything that bears on your present state of health is of interest to me, if you don't mind telling it," I said. "Mind!" he exclaimed. "Did you ever meet an invalid who didn't enjoy talking about his own health? It's the listener who minds, as a rule." "Well, the present listener doesn't," I said. "Then," said Mr. Bellingham, "I'll treat myself to the luxury of telling you all my troubles. I don't often get the chance of a confidential grumble to a responsible man of my own class, and I really have some excuses for railing at fortune, as you will agree when I tell you that, a couple of years ago, I went to bed one night a gentleman of independent means and excellent prospects, and woke up in the morning to find myself practically a beggar. Not a cheerful experience that, you know, at my time of life, eh?" "No," I agreed, "nor at any other." "And that was not all," he continued, "for at the same moment I lost my brother, my dearest, kindest friend. He disappeared, vanished off the face of the earth. But perhaps you have heard of the affair. The confounded papers were full of it at the time." He paused abruptly, noticing, no doubt, a sudden change in my face. Of course I recollected the case now. Indeed, ever since I had entered the house some chord of memory had been faintly vibrating, and now his last words had struck out the full note. "Yes," I said, "I remember the incident, though I don't suppose I should but for the fact that our lecturer on medical jurisprudence drew my attention to it." "Indeed," said Mr. Bellingham, rather uneasily, as I fancied. "What did he say about it?" "He referred to it as a case that was calculated to give rise to some very pretty legal complications." "By Jove!" exclaimed Bellingham. "That man was a prophet. Legal complications, indeed! But I'll be bound he never guessed at the sort of infernal tangle that has actually gathered around the affair. By the way, what was his name?" "Thorndyke," I replied. "Dr. John Thorndyke." "Thorndyke," Mr. Bellingham repeated in a musing, retrospective tone. "I seem to remember the name. Yes, of course. I have heard a legal friend of mine, a Mr. Marchmont, speak of him in reference to the case of a man whom I knew slightly years ago, a certain Geoffrey Blackmore, who also disappeared very mysteriously. I remember now that Dr. Thorndyke unraveled that case with most remarkable ingenuity." "I dare say he would be very interested to hear about your case," I suggested. "I dare say he would," was the reply. "But one can't take up a professional man's time for nothing, and I couldn't afford to pay him. And that reminds me that I'm taking up your time by gossiping about purely personal affairs." "My morning round is finished," said I, "and moreover, your personal affairs are highly interesting. I suppose I mustn't ask what is the nature of the legal entanglement?" "Not unless you are prepared to stay here for the rest of the day and go home a raving lunatic. But I'll tell you this much. The trouble is about my poor brother's will. In the first place, it can't be administered, because there's not sufficient evidence that my brother is dead. And in the second place, if it could, all the property would go to people who were never intended to benefit. The will itself is the most diabolically exasperating document that was ever produced by the perverted ingenuity of a wrong-headed man. That's all. Will you have a look at my knee?" As Mr. Bellingham's explanation, delivered in rapid crescendo and ending almost in a shout, had left him purple-faced and trembling, I thought it best to bring our talk to an end. Accordingly, I proceeded to inspect the injured knee, which was now nearly well, and to overhaul my patient generally, and having given him detailed instructions as to his general conduct, I rose and took my leave. "And remember," I said as I shook his hand, "no tobacco, no coffee, no excitement of any kind. Lead a quiet, bovine life." "That's all very well," he grumbled, "but supposing people come here and excite me?" "Disregard them," said I, and read Whitaker's Almanac. And with this parting advice